Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are once again going to be continuing with our educational speedrun series. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action with a 10-minute game.
Zooming through the game with a bomb cloud start, trashing all your prep like it's modern art. Knight on the rim, he'll still find the win. Chat's going wild, bro thinks he's Hikaru again. Oh hey, hey, he's smurfing play by play, beats you blindfolded, still sipping latte. Queens are flying, eagles meet defeat, just another speed run on Hikaru Street.
So here we go. First game, we're going to play with the black pieces, and our opponent opens with the move e4. Now again, many openings are fine. What I'm going to play this time is I'm going to play the Sicilian opening. As I've said before, Sicilian, Caro-Kann, and I believe e5 are probably the three best moves. d5 also very reasonable. We get the move bishop c4, and now when your opponent brings out a bishop very early, it doesn't matter which opening it is, unless you're super aware of the ideas involving checkmates. Generally against this bishop, you do want to keep an eye on this diagonal, and that is the reason that here I'm going to play the move pawn to e6. Now remember, my opponent has brought out the bishop very early, so by playing e6, not only do I stop the threats on the diagonal, but now I can actually play the move d5, building a bit of the big black center here, and very quickly I should have very free-flowing development, because my opponent is going to have to waste time moving the bishop away, either to b3 or the b5 square with check. Now here I'm going to play the move bishop d7. The reasoning behind this move is that I can't really avoid a fair exchange here, but I should have very quick development anyway. I'm going to move my bishop, move my knight, and castle my king immediately. So move the bishop, we're going to get castles. Now I do have the option here of putting the knight on either f6 or the e7 square. Not really a big deal, but as I've stressed in many of my videos already, one of the things that happens is the more chess videos, the more positions and diagrams you see, the more that your brain puts the dots together. And even though knight e7 is completely fine here, you'll realize that we played the Sicilian opening and this is not the French. Now in the French there are many variations, which I'll show afterwards in the analysis of where you do put a knight on e7 if there is an exchange on d5. But in the Sicilian and in most openings, normally you're looking to develop this knight to f6 and then castle the king. So here I'm simply going to put the knight on the square as I would normally. So now we get this move knight to f4 here, and I'm just simply going to castle my king. Both of our kings are out of the middle of the board. I do have a very slight advantage in development just because my opponent has these three pieces that are underdeveloped, whereas I only have this rook. Ooh, but we get this move g4. Now one of the basic thematic themes about chess is that you generally, when you castle the king, you don't want to push your pawns in front of the king. As with all positions in chess, there are exceptions, but this should not be one of those exceptions. Remember, my opponent also has not developed any of the queenside pieces. Now let's see what I should do. Now what I'm going to play is queen c7, and the reason I'm going to play this move is that I target the knight with the bishop and the queen, and if the knight goes away, I can even take this pawn down by the king. So now we got the move queen to f3. Very logical move. White guards both the pawn and the knight here from being captured, but here I can play the move knight to e5, and suddenly these knights attack both the pawn and the queen at the same time. One of these pieces is going to fall. We get queen g3. I'm just going to take here, opening up the diagonal once again, and now I'm simply up a pawn here, and I should be doing very well. We get f3. My opponent attacks a knight. Now let's see, this knight can go either to h6 or e5. Both squares are completely fine. One of the things, as I've said already in this video, along with many others, is that when you put pieces on squares that are more natural, most of the time your brain's going to associate the squares with the right sort of placement for the pieces versus putting pieces on the rim. And even though knight h6 is okay here, I can freely go back to e5 because my knight guards this pawn, and I want to put my knight on g6 here to cover up any threats on this g file. Now my opponent is using a lot of time here. This is actually a good thing to see, because when you're playing at the lower levels, it is very important that you use your time. You look for specific ideas. It's important that you don't rush too quickly, because you don't have the same feel of the squares and where pieces belong. So even though my opponent has gone to a long think here, I do like what they're doing. So we get the move king to h1. Very logical move. My opponent wants to play rook to g1, go for the double stack and go for a quick checkmate with rook g1 and queen takes pawn to checkmate the king. But one of the big reasons behind me moving the knight here is that I can put this knight here The pawns both guard the knight, but now there simply are just no threats on the file. Of course, it helps that here, because of where the queen and bishop are placed, if my opponent tries to take the pony, I take the queen. I'm attacking this knight with both the knight, the bishop, and the queen at the same time, while stopping any threats on this king side here. So my king is safe, the knight's gonna fall, and I should be close to winning. So let's take the knight. We're guarding it with the knight and the queen here. My opponent will take. I'll take back with the queen. I can actually just pre-move it so that we get the even trade. So now we get the trade of the bishops. We'll probably get the queen trade as well. That's why I went for the quick pre-move here. I can just play knight takes queen. As it stands, I'm currently going to be ahead by one piece here. My opponent plays knight e2. Now this is a bad move because I can simply take the pony. I've got both the knights here that cover up my king. There's no threats on the file. So now I'm up 2 knights here, and most importantly, my king is safe and I have free reign to bring the rooks to the center of the board and attack. We get rook f2. Excellent move. Queen guards the rook, rook attacks the queen and guards the pawn. I'm going to go queen f4 here with 2 extra knights. I'm more than happy to exchange the queens or the rooks off the board. I do not expect my opponent to trade the queens here due to the material deficit, but we'll see what happens. So you get rook g1, more than happy to trade the queens. I'm going to slide the rook to the open file here with the 2 extra knights, the rooks on the open files here. This should be a very straightforward conversion into a victory. So you get the move h3. I'm just going to go rook to e1, checking the king. Now I put both the rooks on this only open file. You'll notice that there are half open files like the G file, but this is the only true open file, and I do control it with the 2 rooks. Let's go rook to e2 here, forcing 1 set of rooks off the board. Again, less and less material, even trades. More than happy to trade off rooks evenly. Get rook g2, more than happy to trade the rooks. Now I'm going to play the move knight to h5, trying to attack this pawn with these knights. My opponent attacks, bring the knight in. Now I can even go for rook to e2 here, simply swapping off the last major force that my opponent has. I don't know how white is really going to continue the game much longer. Rook e2 will lead to a guaranteed win. There are quicker ways to win, but when you're ahead material like this, where your opponent only has pawns on the board, in many cases, as I've said before, as a beginner, it's important to go for the even trades, because when your opponent has pawns, your board awareness might not be best, but if you only have to look at pawns going forward, it's a lot easier than having to worry about diagonals or rooks or queens or knights going every which way. So if you can make the even trades and get down to a situation where your opponent only has pawns, generally if you have lower board awareness, it'll be easier to play. Let's go rook to e2, force the trade again with only pawns on the board. Now I'm keeping an eye on these pawns. If my opponent pushes the pawns forward, I will simply capture them, and the rest should be very, very easy. So you get f6. I'm just going to take the pawn, no reason not to. Okay, let's just play h5 here. I want to fix this pawn so I don't have to be distracted by the pawn going forward. Let's fix these pawns now over here on the queen side. Let's just, I guess I'll just check and bring my knight back to g6 to attack this pawn. Also, no entries. The king can't come forward because the knights control all the critical squares here. Get a5. I think I can take, but I'm just going to bring my king to the center here because I can always take this pawn. There's no real rush. Also, I want to make sure this king doesn't somehow magically get in here to attack my pawns. So my opponent plays b3. I'm just going to go a6. I'm not really in the mood to rush anything. I just want to make sure these pawns can't go anywhere here. Now I can just bring my king forward. I think I'm just going to bring my king forward very quickly here. Let's go king b6. I can actually pre-move this decision because my opponent really only has 2 pawns that can be pushed. If you push this pawn, I capture. If you push this pawn, I capture as well. So I'm just going to bring my king forward here, knowing that these are the only 2 pawn pushes. Otherwise, it's just about this king. So I can just bring my king here. I've completely frozen the queen side of the board at this point. So it's all about finishing the game over on the king side. Bring the king closer. Just going to march the king to f4 here. Now I can take the pawn even on the next turn. Actually, let's keep this king boxed in here. Let's go here. Actually, I'm going to set up a very cool checkmate. So I'm going to go here. I'm gonna go here with check, and now the king is frozen completely, can't move forward, but white has 2 pawns that you can push up the board. So now the way to go for the checkmate, there are many ways to checkmate. I'm trying to figure out which one I want. I'm just gonna go for this, a knight g3 checkmate. There's still a pawn to be pushed, and then we get knight g3, and it's a very clean checkmate, and we win the game. There we go. So let's take a look at, let's review the game very briefly here. One thing I mentioned about this opening is that when your opponent brings a bishop out very early, it could be a Sicilian, it could also be something like what's another opening, it could be a Hikaru, you generally are always worried about this diagonal. So if you can slam the door shut with d5 like in the Hikaru, or here I play e6, stopping the threats and intending to go d5, you always want to be careful when your opponent brings out the bishop very early. Now in openings like e4, e5, bishop c4, this is completely reasonable. This is what's known as the bishop's opening, and in fact it makes a lot of sense because the bishop is unimpeded on this diagonal. You can't put the pawn back, you can't go d5. Usually black will try to play something like knight f6, c6, and try to play d5 to close the diagonal, although this is considered to be fine for white. But when you don't play e5, if your opponent plays bishop c4, closing this diagonal is a good idea. So here I get d5 with the extra tempo, because now after takes bishop b5, you'll notice that my opponent has moved the bishop twice. You go bishop c4 and then bishop b5. Preferably you'd prefer to get a position like, let's just say something like this, where you can go from f1 to b5. It's just one move versus say having to put the bishop on c4 and then go bishop b5. So it's simply a little bit easier to play. We get this, I play d5, we get the trade the pieces, and now the important point here about knight f6. Knight e7 is a completely reasonable move, but normally speaking, with the exception of probably the exchange French, almost always you're going to put a knight on f6 for development. Hikaru, another opening where sometimes you'll end up in a situation where you want to put this knight on e7, but outside of the Hikaru and outside of the French opening, the exchange French specifically, just to show you guys, it's very rare that you're ever going to really consider putting a knight on e7. You're almost always going to put the knight on f6. So unless you play a French or a Hikaru, the natural development more often than not, I'd say probably 90% of the time, is going to be bringing the knight out to f6 and not to the e7 square. And that's why in this game I brought the knight to f6 because of the natural development. We get this g4. Probably here if my opponent had played knight c3 here, trying to finish the development of the queen side, this is better. After d4, black is still slightly better, but the game is probably objectively balanced at the lower levels. Then we get g4, I go queen c7. Now we have queen f3. If you move the knight, I take the pawn and win the game. After queen f3, I get knight e5 here, hitting the pawn and the queen. We get this, takes, knight e5. And here the point about knight g6, I'm just going to set this up, set the scene here. Say we get a position like this. If white can get the rook to g1 here, you have 2 pieces on the open file spying this pawn. If I move the rook, it's checkmate right away. But here I can play knight g6, and what you'll notice is that even though white has a double stack on this g file, if you take, I simply take, and I've got all this protection in front, so the queen and the rook are just useless on this file. And white doesn't necessarily have to take, but if you move the knight and just get a position like rook e8 here, the knight is so well placed. You have all these pawns, you've got the knight, so even though it looks like you have a very strong double stack on the file, there's just no way to attack because of this great pony that's guarded by the pawns, so you never can crash through. So then we got bishop e3. Doesn't really matter if you take, I take the queen and win the game. We get this, takes here. I'm just up a piece here. White could have probably traded, played knight d2, but after rook to e8, you've got an extra knight and you should go on to win the game. All right, so let's go next game. Here we go, second game. We're gonna play with white, and this time I'm gonna play the move pawn to e4. We get the move c5. And now I'm going to do something that I'm not sure if I've actually recommended it yet so far against Sicilian, which is I'm going to play this move c3. Now, this is what is known as the Alipin Sicilian or the c3 Sicilian when you put the pawn on c3. It's a very flexible move because the idea here is to go d4 and build this big white center. My opponent plays this move b5. Now, I believe this is just a clean blunder because I can take. If I'm not missing anything, nothing's under attack here. Everything's guarded. I'm just up a pawn. Now we get knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4. Here I'm going to play this move d3 here, trying to guard the pawn. I'm just going to go for knight f3 and castles. Very, very quick development. Get my king out of the center of the board and argue that because my opponent blundered this pawn on move 2, which I captured, I should simply be up a pawn. And if I finish the development, long run with 1 extra pawn here, 8 pawns on the board versus my opponent's 7 pawns, I should win the game. Let's go knight f3, attacking the pawn, preparing the castle. Get to move bishop d6. Let's castle the king. No reason not to. Just trying to finish my development very quickly. My opponent probably is going to castle here. The bishop of course guards the pawn, so I can't capture it. Get queen b6. Now one thing about these structures, if you get a structure with these pawns on these three squares specifically, there's a couple openings. There's Italian, there's a Rui Lopez. In this structure, very oftentimes you're looking to bring the knight to d2, like you move the rook, move the knight over to g3. Here I'm going to play knight 2 right away, and the main reason is that even though I'm up a pawn here, on top of being up a pawn, I have this very nice square for my knight on c4 to fork the bishop and the queen. My opponent's still a little bit behind the development as well. My opponent's not castled yet. We get queen c7, and now I'm going to go on the offensive due to the lack of development. I'm going to go knight to h4 here. My idea is to play knight f5 here, and you'll notice both of these knights are really well placed here. They're very aggressive. I'm also preparing to maybe play f4 and open up this f file for the bishop and the rook. So all these great ideas here, everything is looking very good. So I go knight f5, attacking the bishop on d6. My opponent plays bishop b7. Now unfortunately for my opponent here, this bishop is just under attack by both of these knights. Your queen is guarding it, but I have two pieces versus the one that guards. So when I take the bishop here, the knight guards the knight, queen can't take, and now I simply have an extra bishop on the board. I should be able to win this game very quickly. Unfortunately, my opponent blundered on move 2, which is kind of shocking. I don't think I've ever seen this move b5 before in my entire life. Maybe my opponent meant to play b6. I'll mention it when we take a look at the game afterwards, but I've literally never seen this move b5 in my life. So you learn something new. Even for someone like me who's been playing chess for a very long time, there's always something new to be gleaned from every game. So all right, let's get back to the analysis. My opponent very properly resigns here. When you play c3 on move 2, the idea is very simple. Let's say my opponent had played b6, which I think was the initial plan. Now white can go d4 here, and after takes you get the big white center, and you get very easy development here. You bring the bishop out. Let's say black plays knight f6 to attack this pawn. You can put the knight here, and then you can play like knight e2 and castles. You can of course go knight to f3 and castles as well. Let's say knight f3, bishop e7 and castles. You finish the development. You have this big white center with the knight and bishop guarding the pawn, and everything is very good. Now usually you're not going to be allowed to just build the big white center for free. Usually your opponent is going to play a move like d5 here, and after takes, white usually should play the move d4, trying to get a grip on the center anyway. And after takes, it's very similar. You bring the knight out, put the bishop on d3, e2, and castle your king. You also have knight c3 to attack the queen as well. Your development is very simple, and you reach the middle game very easily. Your opponent of course can also play a move like knight to f6, and after e5, knight to d5 here. What I would recommend is playing the move knight to f3, let's say knight to c6, and now playing the move d4, building this chain of pawns here. After takes, it's very similar. You generally can put the bishop on d3 or the bishop on c4 to hit both the diagonals. Depends what your opponent does, of course, but again, very easy development. You bring the bishop, castle the king, and then you try to finish this queenside development by bringing the knight and the bishop into the game. So this game was not particularly close. Unfortunately, we got this position. What I did want to point out, the one last thing here, is that this situation where you have these pawns like this specifically can occur in a lot of openings. One of the most prominent ways that you can get a very similar structure is out of the Rui Lopez, where you play d3, you get something like b5, d6, you get c3, bishop e7, castles, and you'll notice that white has the same pawn structure, a little bit like a snake of the 5 pawns. And very frequently what you're going to look to do is you're going to look to move this knight to d2 to f1 to g3, and then possibly to f5. You can also potentially put the knight on e3 and go to d5 or f5 as well. Usually you're going to go to knight g3 because it's going to prepare d4 where the knight guards the pawn, and you have the jump to f5. But there's a very common thematic type of development. Another opening where you get similar situation is you can also have some openings like the Sicilian, where you go bishop c4, you get something like d3, knight f6 castles, or actually sorry, I played the wrong one. You can play something like bishop to b5, black plays something like knight f6, d3 castles, or d3 g6, you get castles, and again you play for c3, and something along the lines of knight e2, knight to f1, and knight g3, where you get the snake pawn structure once again. That's why I played this knight d2 here, just to go forward a bit. Knight c4, knight h4 here. Very important move, by the way, because even though white is already better, my opponent is behind in development here. You have all these pieces that aren't in the game, and when I play knight to h4 after castles and knight to f5, I pressure the bishop here, and if the bishop goes back to e7, now I can play the move f4. My rook and bishop guard the pawn. Everything is kind of opening up here on this f file. I can even bring the queen over, and it's just completely hopeless for black. We got bishop b7. I take the bishop and my opponent resigns very professionally here. So let's move on to our third and final game of this video. So here we go, another game. We're going to play with the black pieces. We get d4, and now I'm going to play the move knight to f6. I expect my opponent to play c4. No, we get knight to f3, and now I have a couple of choices. Now, one thing I've mentioned in some of the previous videos is I do believe the Queen's Gambit decline is one of the best openings. If you get c4, you can play e6. If your opponent goes bishop f4, that leads to the London system, which we've featured very recently, or we can get a move like e3. This is what's known as the Colley system. Now against e3, I'm going to play e6, follow my development. I'm going to play c5 here, knight c6, bishop d6, and castle. My opponent moving very, very quickly here, by the way. A little bit surprised. One of the great things about this opening for white, though, is that it's very easy. You put the bishop on e2, you play b3, bishop b2, knight d2. The setup is very, very straightforward with development, and white wants to castle the king. Both sides have pretty much castled here. I think normally you want the bishop on d3 here to hit this diagonal so that both of the b's are active, but bishop e2 is completely reasonable as well. So we got pawn takes pawn. Now I'm just going to recapture here with my bishop. My opponent plays c4, and now I'm going to play this move b6. Now the reason I'm going to play b6 is I'm going to anchor the bishop on c5 here, so if white puts a queen here, there's no threat. But also by going b6, I can potentially develop this bishop on either of these two squares to create some threats on different diagonals. We get pawn takes pawn. Now here I have the choice, take with the knight or the pawn. If I take with the pawn, it's still fine, but I do create this isolated pawn, so I'm going to take with the knight, and now I'm going to develop my bishop, and now we're basically in the middle game. Even material, very balanced position here, very symmetrical. All our pawns are on the exact same squares. In fact, we get e4. Slight mistake here. One of the reasons I think it's difficult to play these positions as a beginner is because you feel like you need to have a plan, and there aren't a whole lot of easy plans that don't require deep finesse. And e4 is a good example of a move that makes a lot of sense to attack the knight, but in fact it's a bad move because after knight to f4, now I attack the bishop on e2. I have knight d3, but also this diagonal suddenly opens up for my bishop as well. If we look at this position, the diagonal is completely closed right here. If we go back one move here after bishop e7, this diagonal is completely blunted by the bishop. But as soon as you get knight f4, now the knight's well placed to hit the bishop and the pawn. Knight can go to d3, and this diagonal opens up. So we get knight g5. Now this, of course, is a very, very big blunder. I'm going to go queen takes knight here. It's a free pony, and just like that, I'm threatening checkmate on g2, and we get a quick win. Now, unfortunately, I'm not even sure what I can talk about from this game exactly. As I said, the development very easy for white here. If black takes back, you take with the pawn, same thing. Move the bishop, move the knight to d2. Go here, take c4. After takes, I could have taken with the pawn, but I didn't love this position because after, say, something like this and castles here, black has this isolated pawn on d5 that's blockaded by this knight on d4. And even though this is probably fine, it's a little bit easier for white to play. So I took. Then we get e4 here. As I mentioned, this diagonal is completely closed. After e4, now the diagonal opens. I get a great square for the knight to hit everything. Opponent blunders mate in 2, and that's how the cookie crumbles. So because that game is so short, let's do one more game for the memes. Okay, I'm going to play e4 again, just like the first white game we had. Let's go e4. Get e5. And now I'm going to play the move knight to f3, developing the knight and attacking the pawn on e5. My opponent goes knight c6, and now I'm going to play the move d4, playing the Scotch opening that I in fact played as a child when I was learning the game. Now, as I've said many times before, I love the Scotch opening. You do need to know a couple of variations so you don't end up walking into certain traps and checkmates. But if you know that, I think it's one of the easiest openings to play, with very, very quick free-flowing development of all your minor pieces and getting your king out of the center. Now here I'm going to play the move bishop to e3 here, guarding the knight. My opponent's attacking it with 2 pieces. I'm going to guard with the bishop. Very important that you don't play takes, queen f6, and blunder this checkmate in 2. That's why I mentioned you need to know a little bit of theory. But after bishop e3 and c3 here, I'm going to reinforce this pony in the middle of the board here, and I'm doing very well. We get the move d6. Now this move is actually, I think, a mistake, theoretically, because now I can trade all the pieces off the board, and my opponent's going to end up with 3 pawns that are tripled on top of each other. And it's almost impossible for this to not be a very bad position. My opponent will take. I'm going to take. I'm going to trade down into an endgame. Now, as a beginner, you don't necessarily want to do this all the time, but we are getting to a level where we're now starting to play slightly better players. You are going to have to understand some of the themes here. My opponent's going to end up with triple isolated pawns here. The pawns are all on top of each other with nothing to guard them, so we're going to be extremely weak here in this endgame. After I trade, I move my knight to c3, trade, and now the pawns are super weak. I can go knight a4, I can castle my king. If black could put this pawn on a7 on b6, for example, the structure would be very, very good for black. But here all the pawns are completely loose with no protection from either side here. So with no protection, I'm well on my way to a victory. I'm going to castle. I'm going to go knight to a4, hitting this pawn on c5 very, very quickly. Black really has no way of guarding this. If you push the pawn, I take. You can't put the rook on b5, I take the rook. So this pawn is simply going to fall on the next turn, or black is going to lose a lot of material. Okay, let's take the pawn, attack the bishop. Let's see if my opponent is going to fall for the classic trap of taking this pawn on the edge. This is a trap that's very, very common. It's very well known because the famous world champion Robert James Fischer, also known as Bobby, he made this blunder in a game against the world champion at the time, Boris Spassky, in their match. It looks like a free pawn, but after b3, the pawns guard each other, and now the bishop cannot escape the pawns. My king is going to move up and capture the bishop here, and this bishop is not long for this world. Very common trap. If your opponent takes a pawn on the edge with a bishop and it can't get out here, and you get the pawn structure, you oftentimes will be able to trap this bishop. Of course, in Bobby Fischer game versus Boris Spassky, it's a little bit different. Of course, Bobby Fischer would never make such a simplistic error, but he got a bishop trapped in this exact fashion. Now, if my opponent had some time and could actually go a4 and open up the diagonal, the bishop would escape. So I actually really applaud my opponent for playing a5, but unfortunately it's too slow, because after king b2, I still have the pawns, and the bishop is just going to be captured on the next turn pretty much no matter what. It takes. I will take with the pawn, not the knight, by the way, because if I were to take with a knight after a4, I would lose this knight on the file. So I take with the pawn here. Now I'm simply up a piece, just going to develop my bishop, bring my rook into the game. Also do note, because I castled earlier and I checked this king, we go back a few moves right here, you'll notice that I castled. This king has already moved, so the black king in this position cannot castle out of the center of the board. Let's go bishop c4 here, reinforcing the pawn, putting the bishop on a great diagonal, and preparing to bring the rooks to the center of the board. I'm not sure what my opponent will play here. I can also go e5 next move to try and infiltrate with the rook and the knight here. Let's go e5, attacking the knight. Bishop covers the square, and I'm looking to create the classic kebab with rook to d7. Okay, we get knight g4. I'm going to go rook to d7 here. The knight guards the rook. I'm threatening to capture the pawn. Now I am setting up a very nasty trap here for when my opponent takes the pawn at e5 with rook to e1, pinning the horse. And now the knight cannot move, because then I would capture the king. Get f6, and just like that, I end the game very, very quickly. I go check. You can't take because of the pin. Knight guards the rook here. King's got to slide, and then I play knight to e6, and this is simply checkmate. So this game also ended very quickly, but there's a little bit more meat to this game. Now, what I mentioned about playing the Scotch opening is that this variation with bishop c5 is one of the few variations where you need to know a lot. Generally, it's very easy development, like knight f6, you go knight c3, guarding the pawn. You can simply trade, move the bishop, castles, and now after, say, a move like d5, you can take and go bishop g5 here, try and develop your pieces. If your opponent plays rook e8, you can go rook to e1, guarding the pawn. Development is generally very simple and straightforward here, but this bishop c5 line is one of the few variations where you need to know what you're doing. If you're not careful and you play something like pawn to c3 after queen f6, very quickly black is threatening big threats on the diagonal. If you take the knight, you walk into a very fast checkmate that was featured in the famous game between Charlie and XQC. You don't want to do that, so you do need to know a little bit of theory. After you go bishop to e3, reinforcing the knight, normally black will play queen f6, and you can go c3, reinforcing it. And now after, say, knight e7, you play bishop c4, castle your king, and you reach a middle game where the game goes on. Instead, my opponent played d6. I trade everything off, and now the problem is these pawns are simply very, very loose here. As I mentioned, if black could somehow get a trade, let's just say black could somehow get a position like this, for example, and you could get this structure. Even though the pawns are tripled, they're guarded by this pawn on b6, so the pawn structure is completely fine for black. Even c takes b6 would be relatively fine, because now the pawns are all connected. But in this position right here, you can't get a pawn to guard on either side to guard this guard the guard this pawn on c5. So no way to guard this critical pawn here from the side with either of these pawns. This pawn is just going to fall, and positionally black is already close to lost. You get rook b8. Probably the best way to play would be something like king e7 and knight to f6 here. So knight a4, you can go knight d7 trying to guard the pawn, but even this is very, very bad, because after a move like bishop to e2, white wants to play bishop g4 to try and remove this knight off of the d7 square and win this pawn on c5. Get rook b8, knight a4, bishop e6 takes, and now we get the fateful blunder with bishop takes a2. This is something that is very universal. Once again, you're trying to subconsciously connect all the patterns, and when your opponent or yourself, when you see a pawn on the edge of the board like this, if we capture with a bishop, you always want to be careful that there is no idea like this b3 move, slamming the door shut on the diagonal. It's almost universal in that it applies to the second rank. So for example, like let's just say I were to put a bishop here just to illustrate the point. It's almost universally going to be the second rank for both sides where this trap exists, where here if white takes a pawn after g6, they're simply rook to h8, trapping this bishop on the edge of the board. We get takes b3, the pawns guard each other. Now I move the king to win the bishop. Very important, I don't take with the knight, because after a4 I can't move this knight away without losing my king. And now after takes, material is actually even again. I have a bishop, my opponent has a knight, and the game goes on. If I take with the pawn here, now there are no tricks with a4. Go bishop c4, e5, rook d7, rook e1. At this point, if my opponent could castle, it would still be a little bit of a game. With the inability to castle, the game ends very, very quickly. Here we get the pin. Logical. I check. Knight guards the rook. Neither piece can take here on f7 due to the double pin. King f8, knight to e6. And now the king simply has no squares available as the rook and the knight attack the king. So we get another checkmate. We get another win. A couple more games as we continue this educational speedrun series. The last couple of games were a little bit shorter than I would have liked, but nonetheless, I hope you guys enjoyed the games. I hope you guys learned something educational and that you can apply in your future games that you play in this great game that we call chess. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed the latest episode of our educational speedrun series. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back very soon. So I hope you guys enjoyed it and have a great rest of your day. See you. Bye.